You're listening to This Motorcycle Life, conversations about why we ride. Episode 20, Reborn. I'm Bruce Philp. Thanks for listening. Well, have you ever wondered if the love of motorcycles gets old? Well, in a moment, you're going to meet someone you may already know who has a uniquely qualified answer to that question, and the news is mostly good. Before we meet her, let's take care of some important business. First, I want to dedicate this episode's promotional break to the people who listen to this podcast. We hit another download milestone last month. Meanwhile, the number of countries we're reaching now exceeds the limit of SoundCloud's analytics. And my pals at the Nokomoto podcast texted me a few weeks back to say that on that day at least, TML was the number 3 motorcycle podcast on iTunes in the US. Well, being Canadian, I was just happy to be on the podium. Thanks for letting me know, guys, and thanks for sticking with me. As always, I also want to say thank you to everyone who has written me over the last month or so, and to the people who've given this show more ratings and reviews on iTunes and elsewhere. Well, you know how helpful the ratings are, and how much I love to hear from you. I've also started to get topic suggestions from listeners, including a couple of good ones over the last month. A shout out to Susan from the UK, who thought that the love of sport bikes might be just as interesting as the love of Harleys. Well, I bet that's true, and it's a good idea. And to Arnaud from France, who suggested that fear might be worth an episode of its own, and that it might be more relevant than a lot of us would care to admit. And finally, a hi to Mike from here in Canada, just north of Toronto, in fact. Mike wrote me a few weeks back to say that he was about to make his lifelong dream of riding a motorcycle come true, even if he was a little apprehensive about it. Well, it turns out that he passed his M1 exit with flying colors, and in his words, is hooked. Congratulations, brother. We'll see you out there. Okay, here we go. So, I've decided to sell my Ducati. It's always been the oddball among the bikes in my barn. If motorcycles were people, my monster would be like that crazy person you dated in college. Gorgeous, but impatient and sulky when things were too slow, and a bit reckless when it was time to play. I bought it because I thought it was cool, and I felt cooler when I was around it. Ultimately, though, my Ducati was writing attitude checks I could never really cash. The sound of that engine at startup said, "Stand back, something badass is about to happen." But nothing ever did. I still love to look at it, but I'm not a Ducati guy. I just wished I was. And now, as they say, we've grown apart. It's been a surprisingly difficult breakup, though, and the reason it kind of got under my skin was that it was the first real ending in my life as a rider. Other bikes I've parted with were always destined to be temporary, so I felt nothing when they headed down the road. But I was pretty sure the monster was going to be a keeper. Up until now, in fact, life with motorcycles for me was always full of promise. It never crossed my mind that you could wake up one morning indifferent to something that had once thrilled you. Well, of course, it's just a bike, and the ones I have are still awesome to me, and there are plenty more on my wish list. But it got me thinking about whether we should ever take our feelings for granted when it comes to motorcycles. If I could suddenly lose my enthusiasm for something I'd bought in a fog of lust, is anything safe? Is it possible that this thing we care so much about could eventually bore us and our bikes end up collecting dust like garage sale golf clubs? Well, I needed some reassurance. If there's such a thing as an expert on the love of motorcycles, Melissa Holbrook Pierson must be preeminent. Her first book, The Perfect Vehicle, has become a classic of motorcycle literature. On my bookshelf, it's parked next to Neil Peart's Ghost Rider, Ted Bishop's Riding with Rilke, and the space where Zen would be if I hadn't given my copy to someone who needed it more than I did. The Perfect Vehicle is a poetic and honest record of how this all feels in the beginning, and it's given generations of riders a way to put their experience into words, and maybe some comfort that they're not alone. Stories, of course, remain frozen in the moment they're written, but the people who write them keep moving on, just like the rest of us. Melissa Holbrook Pierson has been around motorcycles for 35 years now, with one break, which we'll hear more about. If anyone knows how this passion stands the test of time, I was pretty sure it would be her. Encouragingly, she was eager to talk about this, and she did not disappoint. Spoiler alert, her passion for writing is undimmed, as is her gift for expressing it. I reached Melissa at her home in upstate New York. Melissa, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for speaking with me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. How are you doing?
Doing just fine. It's a beautiful day, and we both should be out riding, but instead let's just talk a little bit about riding and then do it.
Okay, that's a deal, because it's a beautiful day here, and there have not been many of those this spring. Why don't we charge into it? So the reason that I was interested in talking, well, there are many reasons that I would be interested in talking to you, but the reason that you came up as a sort of an idea for this episode was that I wanted to talk a bit about, in effect, what happens when sort of love gets old. And that connects to you because I read The Perfect Vehicle, many years ago, and it seems to provide a kind of capsule in time of what that beginning feels like. Forgive me if I get some things wrong in recalling the book, but I read it when I was in that first kind of giddy rush of passion for riding motorcycles, and I think, like a lot of riders at that stage, I was looking for the words to describe how I was feeling, and maybe get some validation for it. So in other words, am I insane, or am I in fact not alone in the world? And that book gave that to me, and it gave it to a lot of people, I think. And so for me, you are still that person. You're still frozen in time, riding in the rain forever. But in reality, I know that you're not. Time's, moved on for both of us. That book is, more than 2 decades old. And it tells a story that began in the early 80s, I think. And so I'm going to ask you the most unfair question in the world, which is to kind of summarize the last 35 years of your life. What happened to you as a rider? What happened to your riding life, if you like, after we leave you, in your reverie on that Brooklyn street?
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, let's see if we can boil this down. I really can't because, like riding itself, the perfect analogy for what's happened to me, I've had so many different cycles, all returning me to the beginning again, just in the way that each ride sort of returns us to the beginning where we feel what we felt when we first discovered this incredible activity. Mm-hmm. I've gone through, I actually refer to my 2 motorcycle lives, and that is the first one that began at the beginning where I started writing that book more or less immediately. I was writing it in my head for a couple of years before I actually thought, wait a minute, there's so much to say about this. I need to get it down on paper. Mm-hmm. And then I took a 10-year break, ill-advised, but I know it happens to a lot of people. Other aspects of life start taking precedence, and we can't do everything in the world we want simultaneously. And so, I raised a child, and then when a personal crisis occurred in life, the opportunity to return to motorcycles, which, by the way, was not engaged in enthusiastically by me at first. I had to be dragged back in. Now that I'm back in, I look back at that and think, well, you're clearly insane. But yes, I was insane. And, once it was sort of finally put in front of me again, and I could not escape, then I got back on and I found the world new again. Mm. And that's when my second motorcycle life began.
Which I think we'll talk a bit about. I started reading The Man Who Would Stop at Nothing a couple of days ago, so I'm not all the way through it yet, but it anticipated for me how you might answer this question, so I think we'll get to that very shortly. But just another question about The Perfect Vehicle. So it's full of insightfully researched history and kind of a sort of a précis of the lore of motorcycling. But I always think of The Perfect Vehicle as a story about falling in love. And although I think it ends up getting sort of finished and published some years after those first experiences, that's how I think of the book. And so I was curious to know what made you want to write it and what made you want to write it when you did. And I think you touched on this in your a moment ago, but can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, you're exactly right in using the word love to describe it. And we have the experience of, say, falling in love with another person, and suddenly they're all you want to be with, think about, do anything with. They become as big as the sun, right? They're everything. And you want to share that with other people. You want to, jump up and down and collar strangers in the street and say, hey, do you know how great X is? And that's really what I felt like I needed to do. I mean, maybe that's a little egocentric or whatever to believe that other people would be interested in hearing about my particular love. But it occurred to me as I was writing, which is really when most of those thoughts were formed, and, necessitating stopping by the side of the road and getting out my pad of paper so that I wouldn't forget what I was thinking. But, it was really, I thought, holy crap, if I can say that word, this is so unbelievable. It was so everything. It was all encompassing. It was deep. It was layered. It brought in so much of, culture, history, sociology. I thought, here is one subject that has literally many spokes, and I wanted to, explore each one. Motorcycling is the hub or the axle around which this wheel of life turns. And so I just wanted to say pretty much everything I could think of to say. And in that time, that this was, about 1985 that I started writing. Or wait, yeah, no, it was really maybe 1990 that I started writing or thinking about the subject. And there wasn't the history that we have now. I mean, there's, huge bookshelves filled with motorcycling books on every aspect of the sport. But then there was really a pretty thin box of research, and I could go to the New York Public Library when they had a science and technology library, and I went through the card catalog when there was still a card catalog and microfiche, and literally read everything I could find about motorcycles, doing that work from the ground up. And it just excited me. I was, sort of head over heels.
Right.
And that's how that began.
Yeah. And I'm sure you wondered if you'd lost your mind too. I have that thought about this podcast from time to time. But then I hear from people, a few episodes ago, someone actually wrote a poem, which they shared on my website. It just burst out of them. So I think, as I said at the top, you put into words what I think a lot of us feel. And I hope that, after you indulged that, you discovered exactly that fact. So you took a hiatus of about a decade, and in your second book about motorcycles, or if I can reduce it to that, which is called The Man Who Would Stop at Nothing, you used the term, in the introduction, the erotics of risk. So I feel like I'm on firm ground here, comparing the years without a motorcycle to celibacy, in which case, so if that's a fair analogy, then I have to imagine that coming back to motorcycles was a fairly intense experience, was it?
Oh, unbelievably. It was both, intellectually intense and emotionally and, frankly, life-changingly in that it gave me back life. I really realized that in a lot of ways there was an essential piece of me that I had turned my back on, not knowingly, but riding is so essential, I think, to who I am and how I experience the world, that I was sort of only half participating in life in a way. Not to say that I wasn't doing important things or things that also energized or engaged me deeply, but riding is its own category of living, I think. And I only realized the moment that I got back on a bike after that long time what I had missed. But you sort of need to refresh your acquaintance with that every time you ride. When you're not on a bike, when you're not on a bike, you're not on a bike, if you know what I mean.
Right.
You're not, because it's so much about physical presence. It's we all know that, that it's the shortcut to Zen. It's a mindfulness practice, as they say nowadays. It literally is living, because you are in this moment, not in the past. You are not in the future. You are only in this moment. And so being able to realize that at that, after such a long time, I realized I'm not ever not going to ride. I don't want to ever make that mistake again.
Yeah, which I kind of did, and I know that at least some of my listeners, feel that same, pain and intensity. It's funny how it feels like a missing piece, just as you say, which I suppose we could go on about all day. I guess the question that kind of flows from that for me is, did your relationship with danger change? Now, I was going to innocently ask that question, and then I became aware as I was reading The Man Who Would Stop at Nothing that the subject of that book we lost, and so maybe this question, is more loaded than I meant it to be. But as I say, I'll ask it anyway. Did your relationship with danger change?
That's a really interesting question, and it's something that I haven't entirely reflected on, because maybe because I don't want to sit with that in a way. I don't want to think about it, because I both feel myself to be, sort of magically lucky in that I've managed to escape any, serious catastrophe. I don't know why, because it doesn't make sense. I think it's a numbers game, as anything in life is. And so why my number hasn't come up, I don't know. But the idea of sitting around waiting or expecting it is something that I don't think I do now in a way that I did then, which is a little ironic, because I'm now, that much older, and that means, that I have that much less to lose.
Right.
Let's face it. I always found it sort of perplexing that as people grow older, they become more and more risk averse and afraid. But in the end, maybe this is the time when I should take up skydiving or something, because, let's face it, if there's an accident, it's not really going to be, as terrible as if I lost it when I was in my mid-20s or something.
Right.
I'll have a whole lifetime that I would have foregone. But I don't feel the fear as keenly as I did then, which is probably just a function not of the actuality of riding, but really just about having a certain dulling of that level of heightened, anticipation or worry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand that. And I'm not going to ask you again about that subject a little bit later on, because you talk in The Man Who Would Stop at Nothing about this feeling of riding towards the end, and so that's a theme I want to touch on later. But I wonder what you think of this. I got into a discussion about this with someone a little while back, and I said, look, you have to understand that we don't ride to die. We ride because it'll make dying worth it. Does that resonate for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I've said this many times, and I say this in The Man Who Would Stop at Nothing. I mean, I could have a quote unquote safer life if I didn't ride a motorcycle, but would it be a life? I think that living is linked to the amount of risk we're willing to take, whether that's emotional risk, artistic risk. Risk is next door to life, and we're not fully participating in the possibilities of truly living unless we're touching the edge of the possibilities of losing life.
Yeah, that's so true. So the opening lines of The Perfect Vehicle kind of grabbed me by the throat. And the first sort of few words are, at precisely this moment, someone somewhere is getting ready to ride. And so to me, like, that is probably the best couple hundred words about riding a motorcycle I've ever read. And so that's a compliment, but also a setup for the question as follows, which is, does preparing for a ride still feel that way to you?
In a way, it does. I think there's always this gathering of anticipation. You project yourself forward into the moment when you'll be doing it. And preparing to ride is part of the ride, because it's thinking about it. It's also sort of, gathering your gear mentally, at least, and sort of sharpening your focus. And I wanted to, in writing that, I wanted to both, generalize the experience and say, at any given moment, we're all, we're all getting ready to go somewhere, to do something. And it's not just, I didn't want this to just be about me. I wanted it to really be about the experience and have some sort of, universal appeal to the idea of motorcycling. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it was very successful in doing that. And it, as I said, it captured for me. I mean, I've been writing for 6 years, so not a super long time. But for me, that ritual is still, I still love it. I keep my bikes in a barn, and I'm kind of in a dark barn looking out, to the sunlit day, and the engine's running, and I always put my left glove on first, and I check the turn signals and brake lights, and I do all those things. And those, I feel like, I imagine a pilot must feel like there's tremendous weight on getting these few moments right. And so, in a sense, the conceit underlying this whole episode is that I would be terrified to think that intensity ever goes away. And so I guess what was behind my question is, does it change, or is that thrill, still there? That thrill of anticipation.
Yeah, it's just ever renewing. It's like sort of like the Ferris wheel. That it's gonna go up, and you crest, and it goes down again, but then you're going right back up, and it's the same experience each revolution. And I think I don't ever feel that I'm not incredibly privileged to be able to do this. I don't ever feel, that I'm not anticipating anything or everything that can happen, because it's both. It's the everything and the anything that could happen that's sort of bound up inside this one experience.
Well, that's a great comfort, because the image.
No, you're not going to lose it, and if you do, then writing is dead.
Right.
And how could it ever be dead if you're doing it? Because it just partakes of, I don't know, everything that we're here to do, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true, and I hope that's true. I dread it becoming humdrum. So now you've been a lot of places on a motorcycle, and I imagine that travel itself has a way of sort of keeping it fresh. But I'm wondering if you have a familiar loop of some kind. I think you live in the Catskills, if I'm not mistaken. And is there a ride there that you do just to ride? And if there is, tell me about that. And what does a ride like that do for you when you're doing it for the 100th time?
That's a really good question too. I have to say I'm sort of a novelty junkie, and I don't like to endlessly repeat. Although I have a friend who is a far better rider than I am, and he said that he always does the same loop on a regular basis to sort of act as a gauge of his awareness and his ability. And, in the end, that's what a racer does. They're doing the same loop over and over and over again, and you want to sort of perfect. That's the goal, is to perfect, do it better each time, even though it's the same thing. I guess that's how you make it new, because you're on a perfection arc rather than a going from point A to point B arc. And I do have sometimes, when I'm feeling blue, I will return to my favorites. I have a few roads that just feel like home, and I know every curve. And so I feel as though maybe I'm pulling the wool over my own eyes, but I feel safer on those roads because I know that there's a driveway around that blind corner. I know that this is where people are turning left. So I think I can anticipate certain things, and that takes that weight off of the ride. And it's sort of just like returning to this comfortable rocking chair or something. And it's a gift I give to myself. I'm very aware that I have the ability to make myself happy and to calm myself if I need it by going back to a place that feels familiar but is also made new each time, because the experience of it, like I can be on a road that I've been on countless times before, and I'll happen to look up into the sky and think, man, I've never seen that before. There's, your awareness is sharpened, and just by shifting your gaze to something else, there's sort of an infinity of new things you can see in old places.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it. I also have a ride that I feel that way about, and it started out as the most curves I could pack into 2 hours around here, but I've ridden it just like probably a couple hundred times, and the idea of thinking of it as a gift one gives to oneself is sort of a beautiful way of dealing with the discomfort of that repetition, because actually I'm not uncomfortable at all. I love it. And I have a bad habit of listening to music while I'm doing that, and it's pretty blissy. And so, thank you for that. Let's talk about. So you mentioned rocking chairs. Let's talk about motorcycles for a minute. Your riding life began in earnest on a very characterful motorcycle. Moto Guzzi's have a strange way of popping up on this podcast for some reason, but they're bikes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's some kind of leitmotif. I don't know where it comes from, but they're bikes that involve you and they talk to you constantly, and they never let you forget that they're down there, chugging away, and that had to add a lot to the romance of riding in the beginning. I know a lot of people who feel this way about their first Harleys, for example. How did interesting motorcycles stand the test of time for you?
Interesting. Characterful is a very kind way to put it. I mean, I know people who are like, "Are you kidding me? You could never get me on one of those," or "That's so ridiculous. Why are you on that bike when you could have this Honda that will just, just absolutely predictable and almost invisible?" And it's just not sort of what I like. It's like trying to argue with somebody about why you love that woman versus that woman. I can't, who could answer that question?
Right.
Why do you fall in love with the person you fall in love with? Because you like their smell. You like the way that their eyes crinkle when they smile. I mean, really, that isn't something you can say is objectively good or bad. It's just something that calls to you at some very, very, very primitive level. I mean, or, pheromones or whatever is going on with us.
Right.
But I have to say that with modern bikes, there's both something gained and something lost from the time when I knew that I just the problem could be that I forgot to turn the petcocks back on. Now the problem is there's something going on inside this black box that I can't do anything about, and I have to take it back to the dealer so that they can read the code and, do whatever. And there's this, to me, that's both dismaying because there's now this separation between me and the heart of this machine. I can't get at it. I can't really talk to it or listen to it in the way that I used to. But then again, I'm actually putting in more miles these days because, the reliability factor has increased. Of course, until it doesn't, until whatever it won't start because God knows what's going on inside. So.
Do you work on your own bikes?
Oh, that's a very generous word for what I do. I do my oil changes, and at this point I do far less. The days when I spent, hours and hours and hours looking over a friend's shoulder while they taught me how to adjust the valves and whatnot, those days are gone for me. And it both feels like a loss, but as I say, it's also a gain because I've gotten those hours back. I'm spending more money when I take my bike to the shop. And it's a weird thing because it's something that I never did in my first motorcycle life was to turn my bike over to somebody and say, okay, I'll pick it up in 3 days. I needed and wanted to know everything that was being done, and I never felt safe or good about letting anybody, no matter how knowledgeable, do work without explaining to me what they were doing or letting me do it myself under supervision. But that's not happening with the bikes that I currently own, although one of them is a Moto Guzzi, so I still do have a certain, element of surprise.
Yeah, that's nicely put. Yeah, I mean, I feel the same way. I wonder, so I was going to ask you where you draw that line, and I guess the answer is you have more than one bike, and I probably there are a lot of people who employ the same strategy, having bikes that are modern and reliable, and if anything goes wrong, it's going to be a disaster, but it isn't very likely to go wrong, and then other bikes that kind of, speak to your your soul, but ask a little more of you. Would that be a fair summary?
Yes, I think that's exactly it. It's, to me, nothing I ever dreamed was going to happen to me. The idea to own 2 motorcycles, that was like, what? But yes, in fact, I do. And it's an interesting question to me, which I gravitate to for which purpose. When I'm riding local, when I just want to, sort of hop on and fly, I always choose the Guzzi. And when I'm going on a long trip, it's always the BMW. That's the way I roll now. It feels right. They have different personalities, different capabilities, and I'm happy to let them express themselves for their best purpose.
Yep, that's perfect. I feel the same way, and I think that's an excellent strategy. So this goes straight to the N+1 argument that people make about the correct number of bikes to own.
Yes.
I wonder what you think about this. So I've had a few bikes, and some of them have lingered in my life, and some of them have turned out to be mistakes. And the ones that were mistakes were not so much bad bikes as they were somehow just not me. It was kind of like when you buy the wrong jeans, and you're constantly aware that they're tight in the wrong places or whatever. So am I a weirdo, or do we actually wear these things somehow?
Oh, yeah, I think you're exactly right, because that's how my re-entry bike to, life number 2 was a BMW K75. And, after the first few minutes when I was just excited to be on a motorcycle, any motorcycle, very quickly became apparent to me that this bike didn't fit me right, and that's how I describe it. It wasn't a good fit for me. I felt uncomfortable about several aspects of it. Other aspects of it were incredible and wonderful and joyful, and that bike took me a lot of places, both internally and externally. I'm incredibly grateful to it, but I'm also really happy I don't own it anymore. I'm glad it went on to somebody who could appreciate it, for whom it was a much better fit. And then I found, then I was able, I had the time and ability to later focus on what is going to feel right to me. Because when a lot of times, beginners will ask me, well, should I get this bike or that bike? And I say, just get the bike that feels good. And that encompasses, how many different questions. I can't really even enumerate them, but you know it. You know it when you're dancing with somebody who is, on your beat, and it feels effortless. If you have to struggle and you're fighting, and now you have to be conscious of things. I hated the fact that with the K75, I had to be sort of on it all the time. Like, I would turn into a parking lot and I immediately had to scan, okay, where am I going to go to park this thing where I can actually get it back up when I have to leave, or I don't want to be at this angle or that level, or I can't turn it this way or that way. It was really starting to, mess with my head a lot. I don't think anybody wants that because it's like it becomes a barrier between you and riding, and we don't need that. That's not why we ride.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And when you say fits, do you mean sort of only in the sense that it's sort of ergonomically and that it's sort of simpatico with our riding style, or do you make room for the possibility that that fits means is authentic, or doesn't fit means is inauthentic? Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and I'm not sure if that was. I think I was really thinking about this, more or less just on a basic physical level. It wasn't that I couldn't, put my feet down or anything like that. At speed, it was fabulous. But that's not all we do in riding. It's not just, straight line. And I think it just kept interfering with what I wanted to do. It kept tapping me on the shoulder and saying, hey. And I didn't want to be bothered in that way. I don't want somebody talking in my ear while I'm trying to listen to music, for instance. So that's what I mean by it just didn't fit. It didn't feel like my bike. And I think that's a very specific, particular, maybe inarticulable thing about riding a motorcycle. It's just that, and that's why we've got so many different bikes, right? You see people out there on, everything under the sun, and I can look at somebody riding toward me and they're, got their feet up on their high wake pegs and, their arms above their heads, and I'm thinking, how the hey do you ride that, and why?
Right.
But that's not my question to ask.
Right.
Yep, exactly right. It's sort of on my mind. I'm working on a little blog post for some friends who have a website called Eat, Sleep, Ride, and it's about breaking up with a motorcycle, and it's called Dear Ducati. It's not you, it's me. And I think it's kind of falls into that category that you just described so well. And I somehow feel less guilty about it now.
No guilt. That's a time waster, guilt.
Yeah, but, it's people who are as neurotic as I am are excellent at it, so it's not a hard habit to give up. So in The Perfect Vehicle, you shared a lot about your discovery of motorcycle culture. And so not just the bikes and the riding, but also the history and the lore and the heroes. And I remember thinking that process of discovery somehow kind of paralleled the one that I was going through when I read it and certainly enabled it. It was a really cool kind of counterbalance to the personal journey that you were on in that book. And it sort of created a sense of kinship. And I'm wondering, now that you've been around it as long as you have and in as much depth as you have, even setting aside the hiatus, has that fascination with the culture stayed with you? I think I know the answer, but I'm curious to hear what you say.
Yeah, it's just that I no longer feel the need to know everything about everyone who's doing it and all the different factions and subcultures. I'm just interested in being immersed in my own and the people that I meet, because as we know, the people that you meet through motorcycling are the best people in the world. I wouldn't trade that for anything. I mean, I think it was such an incredible stroke of luck to have encountered bikes, and they became the portal into a whole, society. And I think it's like a world that exists almost like a subterranean stream. And once you discover it's down there, you're like, why doesn't everybody know about this? Why doesn't everybody do this? I don't really, there's so much more now though. I could not write The Perfect Vehicle now. I couldn't have any level of confidence that I could even be conversant with all the different strains and strands of riding today, because I think it's just like, sort of nationalism and all the different countries and cultures and languages that there are now, as opposed to those simpler times that people speak of. There's so much out there, and it's, I think, more and more deeply bifurcated, or something. That's not really the right word, but there are so many different streams that I to try to study them or even know what's out there. I'm constantly amazed. If I pick up a motorcycle magazine, I'm thinking, what? People are doing this, and they're doing that, and they're doing that. These are things that I had no idea about. I mean, after I wrote that book, like I said, I thought, okay, I've said pretty much everything that I can think of to say about motorcycling. So I'm done with that subject. I don't ever have to go back to it. But as you know, spoiler alert, I did write another book about it because it felt to me like when I discovered long distance riding and that whole subculture, I realized it was a distillation of the essence of motorcycling, or so it seemed to me. People who do nothing but ride and do it at the most extreme level that can be conceived. It's funny, we're having this conversation right now in the, I think these are the final days of the Iron Butt Rally, which is going on. I forget when it started. I've been reading some of the reports. And the idea that these people are out there doing this incredible, crazy thing that so few people would be capable of accomplishing. And many, many, many people don't even know that it's happening out there in plain sight. Yet it's so hidden. That's what I think a lot of the various strains of motorcycling are all about. They're out there. Nobody's hiding, but who really knows what's really happening?
Yeah. It does have this fractal quality, but I've always been amazed at the same time as that by how the term I keep falling back on is how ecumenical it is. So by and large, other than on the internet, as tribal as motorcycling is, there's still this unifying, kind of force in it, which I think. I mean, I got your fascination with long distance riding, which I want to ask you about in a second. But I share that same fascination with with people who are, dirt track racers or people who are in the custom sort of world or, the urban hipster riders, whatever you want to call those guys. They're all fascinating to me and they all just love what they're doing and nobody gets it. And, but we still wave at each other. And I think that's kind of miraculous. I'm not sure if there was going to be a question in all that, but I think not. So we'll proceed. It's funny. You talked about how you'd said everything you needed to say in The Perfect Vehicle, and then you just sort of described how the experience of being a rider kind of receded into being personal, if I can summarize it that way. I wonder if that somehow is part of growing up too, if there's sort of a resonance here with just what happens when you've seen the world. Does that make sense for you?
Yes and no. I agree with you to a certain extent. And then to another extent, I realize that human beings are always inventing new things because as a way to sort of colonize experience for themselves. Each new generation comes up with something new because they need to own it. They need to write the rules. And the code. And so, some of them are taking old stuff. And as you say, I do find we'll just say urban hipster for, shortcut. And I don't mean that disparagingly,
no.
Even if, certain aspects of it seem a little like, oh, really? You're kidding me. Right. But, taking old bikes and, making them somehow new, both borrowing from this, the mythos of the past, the Easy Rider era,
right.
if such a thing ever really existed. I'm not entirely sure it did, but, and remaking themselves new in the style of the old. I have a lot to say about which I won't about the whole craft maker movement and what its role might be in our mass produced era when we feel so distant from the things we use and that surround us that we as human animals, I think we just want to we need to put our stamp on something and know that we're invested, sometimes quite literally, in terms of building something from the ground up. It's ours, it's not anybody else's, and it didn't roll off the manufacturing line, and it's sort of anonymous. We need to possess things in a way, and we also need to remember who we were centuries ago. I think we need some sense of continuity with our own evolution. That's part of what I'm really not going anywhere with this, but I do find that a really, really super interesting phenomenon when I go down to New York City and I see what people are riding and the places that they meet. And that's part of it. It's not that these people are, I'm just going to ride my Honda 4, just all by myself. No, they're going to their meeting places so that they can be with others who sort of get it and who speak the same language, the same aesthetic language, or whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah. I suspect we're in agreement. I mean, there are definitely sort of cringing moments, when you're in that scene, sort of little bit cosplay. But I mean, there are a lot of cosplayers in motorcycling. They're not just the urban, custom guys.
And there always have been.
And there always have been. That's right. But, I'll take that in exchange for, the interest in keeping this alive, the idea of sort of putting your hands on a bike and, kind of understanding that, how it works and that matters to you somehow and being engaged with it as opposed to treating it as an appliance. That seems healthy to me. And so does the maker thing, honestly. Mm-hmm. In your second book, the Man Who Would Stop at Nothing, or second motorcycling book, so that book is dedicated entirely to long distance riding, and you, I think, in that book you describe long distance riding as being near the very heart of motorcycling, and I'm wondering what makes it so special. What is it that hit you that way so hard?
Because I felt I was seeing people who had, for whom motorcycling wasn't just an adjunct to their quote unquote regular life or a pleasurable pastime. It was that they had dove headfirst into a very deep pool and were going all the way down. It subsumes them. It is them. I don't think I've ever seen any group of motorcyclists more deeply involved with what motorcycling is, which is movement through space and time. And that's all they do. They've stripped away everything else. There's no concern about how they look or what other people think about them, or the achievement is all personal. I think it's really equivalent to say extreme climbing. It's they're doing it because the mountain is there and because they themselves want to see how far they can go. Just as, sort of as an organism, where's the edge? And the edge keeps getting pushed out farther and farther. And they're doing it in a way that I don't think that anybody else really is invested as fully as they are.
Yeah, I mean, I'm getting that from the book, and I have to say, before starting to read it, the iron butt thing was just something I did not understand. I got that people were passionate about it, and God love them, and they would have my full support, but I just kind of didn't get it, and I'm starting to. But it seemed to me that you sort of have anointed it as somehow the. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but as somehow being, the rune, the kind of, the sacred stone that explains all the rest of it, if I can put it that way. And I'm just wondering, how do you line that up against, people who ride dirt bikes or people who build things and ride them, so the other kind of corners of this pastime that express themselves differently. Is it superior in some way?
Yeah. No. See, I don't want to say that. It was just really that this was the one endeavor that I got close to and was able to see from the inside a little bit, even though I was never a long distance rider, and I'm not cut out for it, and that's not going to be my path. But I sort of skated close enough to, I think, be able to understand because I observed and because I, tried it a little bit. I got it. I understood something that for me in my prior life was inexplicable or really, frankly, didn't even exist. Like I think I might mention in the book that in my first book, I think, the Iron Butt Rally literally had one line dedicated to it, and then I was off to something else. But then I saw that there was a whole world within this world, and that world seemed to me to express something essential about why motorcycling can be so alluring and all-encompassing. And I do know people, for instance, who are, into riding dirt, and it's every bit as absorbing for them as long-distance riding is for those people who do it. And I think there's any number of things that do the same thing. They just do it slightly differently, and there's a different motorcycle under you, and you're on a different surface, and you're with different people, but they're all sort of the same thing because motorcycling has so many things that it can give us. I mean, that's why I feel like I'm never going to reach the end of what I have to say about motorcycles in writing. Because I think that motorcycling itself is infinite.
Yep, I think that's right. And that was sort of a kind of a jerky question to ask, but I felt like I just needed to kind of, put a pin in this idea that this was, close to the heart of motorcycling. Because in fact, I mean, your description of the start of the Iron Butt Rally, I think it was incredibly vivid, and the allusions you made to, kind of knights and armor and all that stuff really touch on some very primitive kind of, archetypes, if you like, that I think are close to the heart of motorcycling. I mean, even if we're doing these things, even if we're engaged in this activity, as a group, at the end of the day, it's the solitariness of it that I think gives it. So this is one guy's opinion, but it's the solitariness of it that I think gives it its soul, if I can use that word, and that came through loud and clear in the portrait that you painted of these people. Something that I hear a lot, either in these words or in words very much like them, is the sentence, "Motorcycles saved my life." In fact, I became aware of the perfect vehicle when I was, kind of observing an internet forum in which people were discussing, mental health and motorcycling. And a young woman from Florida, I think, raised the subject of this book as something that had gotten her through some difficult times. So that's a pretty powerful thing for somebody to say. And I think in one way or another, a lot of riders' genesis story involves some kind of salvation, whether a boat played a role or not. And people get quite passionate about this. Frankly, I still look at my bikes that way, as some kind of spiritual lifeboat. But thinking about the sort of overarching question of this conversation, I wonder what happens after we've been saved. When that story is drifted into the rearview mirror, what then? Or are we saved over and over? Maybe that's going to be your answer. Do you have a perspective on that?
I think for me, what it is now, after I've been saved, now I feel gratitude for the thing that saved me. I'm sort of overflowing with gratitude, and I get to ride in gratitude. And I think that's, I'm going to sound like, a TED Talk now or something, but I do think that, going out from the self, from the center of the self to, a different perspective where we can turn and look back at ourselves and say, something else is responsible for my happiness, and that is my connection to what I do, my connection to my aspirations, my connection to the people who have helped me. I didn't get any of these places by myself. It was always through the agency of somebody else who was pointing the way. I mean, in essence, pointing back to me, but by saying, here's this motorcycle. That's why I call it the perfect vehicle, because it's, that's both literal and, emblematic. It's a metaphor for what we can hear and accept. If you're open, then you might get the chance to reflect on why you're here and what you really ought to be doing with these moments that you've been given through just stupid luck.
Right. So gratitude is a perfect answer to that question. And I'm slapping my forehead with my hand that I didn't think of it myself. But I can't help but notice again a parallel that we talked about a few minutes ago, which is that in as much as after you've been saved, the next thing should be gratitude on a motorcycle, it feels to me again like this is also a passage that you have to go through just by aging, if I can use that terribly percussive word.
Yeah.
That this somehow there are parallel lines here, that the experience you have as a motorcyclist, who is not new anymore, is not altogether different from the experience you hope to have in the course of your life. Am I overworking this, or does that resonate for you?
No, you've cracked the nut. I think that's exactly it. I mean, if we don't, as we go on, sort of get onto a cherry picker and go up and look back at our smallness and at our situation, our place, and reflect a little bit on how we've gotten to where we've gotten, then there's no way forward, because you don't know sort of how to approach the rest of life. If you don't realize, if you don't feel like you can reflect on how you've gotten to this point. And I don't know, I view that as one of the, very few nice things about aging, is that, it puts me continually in a place where I think back to the things that happened to me, just, from happenstance, and the fact that I was, not consciously maybe, but somewhere in me, I was open enough to receive them. I could have closed the door on those experiences, right? I could have said, I'm too afraid, or, My parents don't like this, or what will other people think, or maybe this isn't the best use of my time or money, or any number of things that could have deflected, this arc that I was on. And now I have a certain sense of rightness about just, not in a mystical sense. I'm a stone atheist. I don't believe that anybody preordained anything for me or is looking out after me or really, frankly, gives a, flying, about what happens to me. Nature doesn't care about us as individuals. We are not valuable. We make our own value, I think. So
yeah,
that's what writing has given me.
Yeah, I hear, and I agree. I mean, and my approach to spirituality is not altogether different from how you just described yours. But I do think that the one duty we have to our existence is to self-actualize, and it seems to me your work, as an author, has been an attempt to document doing so through motorcycles. So that seems legitimate. And actually sort of takes me to the next question I wanted to ask, which is you wrote motorcycles are a way into yourself and a way out. And I'm wondering if you can reflect on that. What did you mean then, and what do those words mean to you now?
What did I mean? Gosh, I don't know. Sometimes I write in a fever dream, and it doesn't necessarily correlate to any actual perceivable thought. But I think that they do ask you, or in moments of extremis, which is what they're good at putting us in, and we both want to get to that point where we're going, oh my God, and we don't. I think it asks of us to to reflect on what we're capable of, and that sort of the problem solving itch that we as the human species, that's how we evolved. We're great problem solvers, and that's why we're still around. And so there's this urge to do that for ourselves over and over again. That is living. That is facing our mandate as human beings, is to problem solve. And it's not pleasant when it's going on, but then when it's over, then you have a sense of accomplishment. But it's a way out of an incessant, sort of obsessive, the prison of the self, really, where you are always turning inward as if, you're the only, person in the universe, and your concerns are all there is. And I think motorcycling is some kind of a great leveler, in a really good way. It shows you're not special, and you're connected. You hit on that paradox before about the isolation of the rider. At the same time, we're deeply connected to all the others who are also doing that same thing alone.
Yep. That's the significance to me of the wave. I wave at everybody who's got two fists in the wind, and I wave at all children. So maybe the reasons are a bit different,
right?
but to me that sort of grabs that idea. And I always laugh when I see people debating helmet laws online, because I believe in personal autonomy and freedom of choice and stuff like that. But deep inside, my defense of wearing a helmet is less to do with safety and more to do with the fact that it's really awesome in there. The places you go.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I love it. That's why, for one thing, I don't listen to music while I'm riding, and I'm not connected to my phone or GPS. I need to, have that channel open where my interiority joins with, the greater universe or something like that. And I also, frankly, get a lot of thinking done. Yeah. It's an incredible problem-solving tool. I'll have some kind of horrible conundrum that keeps me up nights, and then I get on my bike and I'm riding along and thinking about where I'm going next or what turn to take, and aren't the trees beautiful? And the next thing I know, it's there in some kind of crystalline clarity, the solution to the problem.
Yeah.
I haven't been thinking about it. It's not been present. It's like, and I don't want to lose, that when it should appear. So I need and want to be alone. I don't want to have intercoms. I don't want any of that. I just don't want any interference with that sort of, long line of music that writing creates out of thought and non-thought, both.
Yeah. Yep, that unconscious processing. So at the end of The Perfect Vehicle, we find you walking in Brooklyn, and you're suddenly overcome by the memory of a ride. I forget what triggered it. It might have been a smell or something. And this idea kind of comes up from time to time in that book, this idea that there's the sense that motorcycling so totally saturates your life that it's all you think or dream about when there isn't something more present to displace it. And I think you talked a bit about that earlier in our conversation. Under the heading of, old love, do you still have moments like that? What happens to that feeling as time goes by?
I dream about riding sometimes when I'm not riding, and especially over the winter, I'll have this, it'll invariably come to me one night, obviously when I'm probably anticipating. I ask myself somehow in the middle of the night, am I going to be able to ride again? Will I have forgotten? What does it really feel like in the way that when you try to capture, somebody's face that you love, say you're away, and you try to remember what they look like, and you go, oh my God, I can't even actually remember what they look like because they're too close to you. They're too beloved that you forget the concrete details. But I think, riding is so elemental that it gets into your blood and it becomes a part of you once you've had certain heightened experiences in life that they repeat. They repeat like, I don't know, like music, like dreams, like those things that you can't forget. If you, say, memorized a great poem when you were in 5th grade, you could still remember it when you're 80,
Yeah.
Because it connected with something, it sort of fused with your molecules. So, yeah, it might not feel quite as potent to me now as it used to, when it did feel like it was, literally the dawning of a new age, and I was going to be new, and it was always new. So maybe it's not quite as lyrically present to me now, but all I need to do really is get back on a bike, and then instantly it's like, what were you thinking? This is everything,
Yeah. Yeah, which again somehow parallels life, or at least relationships. I'm just now reading The Man Who Would Stop at Nothing, and last night I kind of got stopped in my tracks by the passage you wrote about riding past 50, and you called the feeling riding towards the end. And earlier in this conversation, you said, well, I'm an older rider now than I was before, and that means I've got less time in front of me, and so why don't I take more risks? I've got less to lose, which is a very rational way of looking at it. But the feeling I got from the book was kind of the opposite. It sounded to me like you were deeply sensitive to the preciousness of it. I mean, you at one point said that, you wished for just one more life. That strikes me as a bit of there's a bit of a conflict there. What am I missing? How do you really feel about this?
Yeah, I don't know. It depends on what moment you ask me. I mean, I don't know. I guess I am overly sentimental, and sometimes I look back at my life and something will flash before me, and I'll remember a sense that, you know, I'm, of course, I'm immortal and I'm going to live forever, right? And I'm always going to have endless chances. And I think there comes a point in life, and for me it was, you know, around 50, when it suddenly hit me, actually, no, you really don't have endless chances. You're not going to, you know, write some, you know, you're going to write a book of poetry, and then maybe I'll try a novel, and then I'll do, you know, no, each one of those is a 5 to 10 year investment, and you actually don't have, you know, 80 years left. You just don't.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to pick and choose. So that does make it, you know, it's sort of wonderful. That's the gift inside this sort of crappy wrapping paper of growing older and realizing that you are quite mortal, and that the end, you can actually count it. You know, nobody really knows, of course, but you can at least say, I don't have endless numbers of years in which to reinvent myself and check out this possibility and that possibility. No, you have to focus what is most important.
Right.
You strip down to your top 3 priorities, and then you say, these are the things I really want to get done. And then you go and do them. You know, you don't sit around and wait for the ideal time or for, you know, circumstances to be exactly right. So now I can finally take this trip, or I can embark on that project. No, let's figure out which things are most important and do them.
Yeah. And that's, well, obviously writing's going to pass that test till I can't anymore. But I wonder if this somehow connects to this notion of gratitude. If you're acknowledging that some doors are going to start to close, and your job is to pick the ones that stay open, it seems to me the things you're the most grateful for are the ones that are going to survive that process somehow. I'm kind of thinking out loud. You put it to me in an email when we were organizing this. You described this stuff as exactly what I think about and live pretty much every minute. Motorcycles are everything. Which sounds like 2 things. One, it sounds like somebody whose passion is undimmed. And secondly, it sounds to me like a vocation. It sounds to me like you have come to understand it as a vocation. Is it? And how did that happen?
It happened really because of, you know, adversity, the trials that, you know, the personal trials that everybody experiences if you live long enough. They've paradoxically given me the greatest gifts that I have. And I want to, you know, as an act of gratitude, put that to use in terms of both, you know, choosing wisely and appreciating the endlessness of this one experience. I'm not going to, at this stage in my life, you know, decide that actually I think I want to sail around the world. So now I've got to learn all about sailing, right, and then, you know, practice, and, you know, it's just not going to happen. So I can augur down into this one experience that luck has put in my way and see what more is in there. And the more I look into it, the more I realize it's a mirror reflecting, you know, the totality of experience. It can be not only what you want it to be, but it can, if you open yourself to what it's really saying, it's saying this is an analogy for the journey that life is. It has a beginning, it has an end, and both those things are good, and both those things should be appreciated for what they are, because you can't have one without the other. I'm sorry, you don't just get to start and then keep on going. It's so learn to appreciate the gift of the end as well, because then it gives meaning to the sweetness of the beginning,
right?
And it imbues the whole trip becomes, bittersweet. I don't know how else to live without regret or without, experiencing loss and, all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So I see that, that writing does have all of those things inside of it, and I can't turn away from any part of them, the good or the bad or whatever. And it sort of transforms the bad into the good when you realize that.
Yeah.
It's all it's a continuum.
Yep. That makes perfect sense. It's funny. I've been struck by how welcoming motorcycle culture is to the sort of artistic and literary, kind of elements. I mean, I've met motorcycle photographers and motorcycle filmmakers and motorcycle writers, and there are, believe it or not, motorcycle poets out there. We it seems like we welcome them all, and we don't we're not rendered uncomfortable by what art brings to this, and so your work certainly qualifies as literary. And I guess I wondered, did you know this about us when you began writing, or was it a happy discovery? Because I assume that this has also been your experience.
Yeah, no, here's what's really funny is that I wrote The Perfect Vehicle thinking that its audience would be people who had never ridden. Okay. I mean, all right. I know how naive that sounds now, but I assumed that motorcyclists were not going to be interested in this book at all, because after all, they knew everything that I had written about. They had experienced the ride. They knew the history. They knew all that stuff. So why would they read something that already replicated things that they knew? And instead, I thought that, somehow or other, the great majority of people somehow were interested in learning about our experience. Well, nobody who didn't already ride ever picked up this book, or, they might have maybe two or three. Instead, right almost as soon as it was published, I started hearing from riders who said, "Oh my God, you finally articulated what it is that I was feeling, but I never knew what that was. Right. And I didn't understand what motorcycling meant to me." And so it was, the word you used before, a validation of their experience. And that's the audience for the book, and the people who truly appreciate it are those who have already experienced it. They just had never maybe read it. And I wasn't really aware at that time that I'm just a part of a long line of people who are trying to capture what this means. And because it's an infinite experience, there's an infinite number of ways to do that. There's so many facets of writing that trigger, aesthetic reflection and become the foundation for, a parallel creation or, something. We want to capture it somehow.
Yep.
But something about it makes us want to grab hold of it or, put it on canvas or whatever is your medium and sort of freeze it. And so you can turn it around and show it to others and say, this is what it's all about.
Yep, exactly. And so I have The Perfect Vehicle on my bookshelf right between Riding with Rilke and Ghost Rider. So I think I mentioned when I first approached you that I thought it was canonical, and that's my proof of that. And this desire to kind of express how it feels is really what I think powers a lot of this. I did an interview last fall with an artist named his nom de guerre is Tempest Deficit. And his name is Doug Thompson. And what I adored about his work was these images of motorcyclists, kind of at full chat, except they were suspended in the air from big red balloons. And for some reason, that just spoke to me, in a way that all the, sort of hell-bent for election kind of, meatloaf bat out of hell imagery just never did. And it was such a joy to talk to him as it is to talk to you, that was his mission, was to explain how it feels. And it really is riders who want to hear that most. So before I let you go for that ride, why don't let me just have a little bit of a lightning round. I've got a few just quick questions for you. And the first one is, what is the best book about motorcycling that you've ever read?
I think the one that sort of galvanized me the most, and I won't say there's a best book about motorcycling because there's any number of ones that are, fabulous one-offs of people's experiences. But when I discovered One Man Caravan, that just blew my mind. And then, of course, I got to meet Robert Fulton, and that was really special. So, I got to connect the person to the incredible feat that he had accomplished in riding around the world at that time. Now I won't say it's a dime a dozen, but at this very moment, there's, we couldn't count the numbers of people who are out on round the world trips right now. But then it was special.
Yep. That's a good one and true. So my next question is, have you ever actually found the perfect vehicle? I think what you called it was the bike of the mind. Is there a bike out there somewhere that, that is your white whale that haunts you?
No, that's why it's the bike of the mind, because it doesn't really exist.
Right.
Perfection doesn't exist. It's like, did you ever find the perfect mate? They're perfect for a time, but that's usually the time when you're imagining them more than you're really, with that ideal person. But which is not to say that they become unideal; they just become real, which is another kind of poetry, I guess.
Yeah.
To be real.
Yeah. Well, that's a fair answer. And then I wanted to know, do you still love riding in the rain?
Yeah, it's such a weird thing. Talk about paradox, it's all those things. It's isolating, and I think it just heightens the experience. The parts of it that make you really anchor into the here and now. Because you better be aware of what's going on.
Right.
And it's extremely uncomfortable. And I think that's also one of the secret joys of riding is when you become really uncomfortable and then you know that at some point that's going to end.
Yep. It's funny, and I don't think you're alone. A couple of episodes ago, I interviewed a guy named Eric Gorgeous, he builds choppers in Detroit, and has more recently become a television personality. But he kind of went off on this poetic rant about how he loved riding in the rain, and it sounded like maybe with no helmet, because he talked about how the raindrops felt like razor blades, and he loved that. And it just obviously made me think of that passage in your book. But I was curious to know whether that particular aspect of the romance had endured. And so finally, I'm thinking about another line from The Man Who Would Stop at Nothing. And so after all the miles and all the years and all the people and all the places, is motorcycling still cool?
Oh, yeah. How could it never be, remain cool? I feel, I shouldn't say this at my age, but I feel like, hey, man, I'm still cool, right? At least, before I take off my helmet, and then people go, huh? But yeah, I think it is really the essence of cool. I don't, maybe fighter jets. Okay, they're a little cooler, but motorcycles will have to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I've actually had this debate about the airplanes versus motorcycles thing, and my trump card is always that, in an airplane, the nearest obstacle is a kilometer away, but on a motorcycle, it's millimeters away, and that seems to shut people down. I think it's cool too, but I'm encouraged that you still feel that way. Look, Melissa, I've so enjoyed this conversation. I can't believe we burned through an hour and a half speaking. I can't thank you enough for being interested and for giving me the time. It's just been a real privilege, and I love your work, and I look forward to more of it.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure.
Stay safe out there.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks. None of life's really big questions ever seem to have a simple answer. And this one, does riding ever get old, is no different. The good news seems to be that no, it doesn't. Motorcycling can be evergreen. As long as we're physically capable, we can be reborn every time we thumb the starter. Reborn was Melissa's word, and it's, well, perfect. In hearing her talk about this, in fact, you could still catch the echo of the young woman who once wrote that the idea of riding a motorcycle filled her with a weird blend of wary surprise and pure happiness. But she also said that riding is its own category of living, and like every other category of living, it probably demands something of us. Melissa called it a mindfulness practice. She talked about the importance of gratitude as the thing that comes after we've been transformed, and about the gift of the end, and the way that knowledge makes every moment on the bike, if not more thrilling, then certainly sweeter. And if all this is starting to sound a bit like a TED Talk, then maybe you've already figured out the real answer here. Motorcycling, as so many riders have observed, is living, so it stands to reason that the way we'll feel about it when we're old will depend very much on how we feel about life itself. Those two things are intertwined, it turns out, and will remain just as bound together for each of us then as they are right now. In other words, no matter how many years we do this, motorcycles will always have one more thing to teach us. And it's that the only way riding will ever feel old is if we do. Well, thanks for listening. You'll find show notes for this episode at thismotorcyclelife.com, and I'll include a link to Melissa's website where you can discover more of her work. That's also how you can reach me if you have questions, comments, or suggestions. Emailing me at thismotorcyclelife@gmail.com works too, and every email gets an answer. You can also follow me on Instagram, where I like to post pictures of bikes I find on the street. Melissa isn't on Instagram, but you can say hi to her on Facebook, and I hope you will. For this episode's playlist recommendation, we return to Canada and a jazz vocal group from Toronto called Cadence. There's something fitting about the fact that these guys sing without instruments. They're kind of like the motorcyclist of the jazz world. But one track in particular completely won me over for this episode, and it requires no explanation. The song is still crazy after all these years. You can buy it wherever you like to get your music, and in the meantime, keep staying alive out there.
I met my old lover on the street last night. She seemed so glad to see me, I just smiled. And we talked about some old times and drank ourselves some beers. Still crazy after all these years. Oh, still crazy after all these years. not the kind of man who tends to socialize. Oh, I seem to lean